All right, everybody. Hello. Welcome to the second episode of the JDO show relaunch. I'm your host, J. David Osborne, and today on the show we are discussing Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. Could potentially be the first part of a two-parter. We'll have to see how far Scott and I get. Let me introduce our guests. So today I have on my very good friend, Scott Adlerberg, whom I'm sure a lot of you listening to this know Scott already, but if you don't, Scott is the author of Graveyard Love and Jack Waters. He also hosts the Reel to Reel film talks in Bryant Park every summer. That's in Manhattan, right?
Right.
Yeah. And he also has an article coming out here soon on lithub.com about Ishmael Reed. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
That is correct. On Crime Reads, which is part of LitHub, on Ishmael Reed and on a certain aspect of Mumbo Jumbo. There's even a crime sort of detective novel aspect to the book, and I went into a lot of detail on it in the piece. It'll be out soon. So
Perfect.
After this, people may want to look for that. It's an interesting article, I think.
So I want to get started with how we came to discuss this particular novel. I believe you had mentioned it to me in passing because for those of you who don't know, Scott and I talk at length on the phone. We're getting up to twice a week now. It's pretty extensive conversations about all manner of things that are not fit for podcasts, and some that are. So you had mentioned this book several times, and I can't remember the exact context that Ishmael Reed came up in, but you said you got to read this book. And since I had begun to approach this podcast as something where I analyze a book every week rather than just kind of have a normal sort of conversation, I thought Mumbo Jumbo would be a great one. And, you had recommended it to me, and then I started reading. And sort of right off the bat, so we have a main character, Papa Laba, who is a voodoo priest.
Kind of a voodoo priest. He calls himself kind of an occult sort of detective. Right.
And so you get into the world of the book, and there's this kind of mind virus. So it's based in the 1920s in New York, and there's this mind virus called Jes Grew that is sweeping the nation. And what it does is people who become infected with Jes Grew become, I guess, cool, you could say. They start to do things.
Yeah, that's one way. You could put, that's definitely true. You could put it that way.
They start dance.
Dancing a lot.
Right. And so basically this thing that's sweeping the nation becomes a problem for American secret societies, amongst whom.
And should point out that the Jes Grew, according to the book, it's set in the 20s, the Roaring 20s. Warren Harding is the president. Has apparently appeared before in the United States.
In 1890.
In the 1890s, which was just around the time, coincidentally or not, ragtime was becoming popular. It always seems to pop, and it seems to have some connection with New Orleans and maybe, the sort of Black population in New Orleans and the people who practice voodoo and believe in many gods. There's a connection maybe with Haiti, perhaps. So it's got this sort of nebulous kind of feel to it, but that's sort of where it's kind of when it pops up in the 20s. It's not the first time. Exactly.
Right. So actually, before I move on with the rest of the plot, let's talk a little bit more about Jes Grew, right? Because I think you had a nice summary there. But essentially, Jes Grew is not just music. It's also speech. And and it's not just speech. It's also Black letters, it's poetry, it's essentially Black culture is how I understood it. It's this kind of untouched it's hard to not use the language of the novel because I almost said untouched by the Atonists, which I guess we could get to here in a little bit as well. But it's essentially this kind of element of sort of soulfulness that runs through particularly African-American cultures that's beginning to infect primarily through music, but also through other works of art.
And it seems like the actual phrase does have a real, derivation. I have the book with me now, so I'm just looking at this. But he quotes in the beginning one of the sort of epigraphs um, James Weldon Johnson, great poet, black, African American poet. And the epigraph says, "We appropriated about the last one of the Jes Grew songs. It was a song which had been sung for years all through the South. The words were unprintable, but the tune was irresistible and belonged to nobody," which kind of sums up kind of like what Jes Grew is. It's kind of like hard to define. And like you said, the words are unprintable. It's not something you could just say, this is what it is, but it's irresistible. And the other thing is that's important to note is, even though it definitely seems to derive, or does derive, from African American culture, it's not something that only African Americans can buy into, can ascribe to, can use, which is one reason the Atonists, and we'll get into that later, what they are, and white people fear it, because it's not something that's going to be confined to the black ghetto. It's going to spread.
That's right. That's right. And I think that when you said that it's nebulous, that hits the nail on the head, because it takes this entire 200-something page novel to sort of get your head around what Jes Grew is. As a matter of fact, it kind of takes the whole novel to get your head around what exactly is happening. It takes the whole novel and a rather extensive segue into Egyptian mythology to sort of understand the entirety of what's going on.
Right.
But
that Egyptian mythology is, a very that 40 pages of Egyptian mythology as Ishmael Reed presents it, I thought was one of the best things I've ever read. It's not he reinvents Egyptian mythology, to be honest.
Yes, he does. Yeah, he does. And oh man, it's going to be so hard not to jump around. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about the way that the book is written, because I think that people who are listening to this podcast will find this interesting. I did a little looking on Amazon, and I looked at the 1-star reviews of this, and this is one of those rare cases where, so there's one person on Amazon who did not like this book because the book arrived to him in poor condition, which you'll always find.
Okay.
The rest of the negative reviews all had to do, and I hate to sort of simplify it in this way, but it was people who were kind of too stupid to get it. It was people who were just like, I don't get what's going on in this book. I'm so confused. Characters pop up, they disappear. So I'll hand the ball over to you here. Can you kind of describe the structure of the book?
Okay, I think that's, you're right. We should start with that. I think that's important, because to begin with, the book was written, it's Ishmael Reed's third novel, and it was published in 1972. Okay, he'd written 2 books before that, and published 2 novels before that. And that's important. It's basically, you read it now, it may seem strange. I mean, it is a strange novel, but it's definitely right in the tradition of that time, a great postmodern novel. There's no other way to describe it. For people who like or read Thomas Pynchon, everyone else we're going to name is white. So, I mean, that's one thing where Ishmael Reed really sticks out. But Thomas Pynchon or Donald Barthelme or John Barth or Robert Coover, that generation of writers, if you happen to like those people, Tom Robbins to an extent, and I grew up on those writers. I love those writers. This is absolute. So basically, it's not a novel that in any way is a social realist novel. It's partly it's very much a satire. The characters have ridiculous names like Biff Musselwhite.
It's a very funny book. Yeah.
It's a very, very, well, first of all, we should say that it's a hilarious book. It's really an hysterical book. The characters are not 3-dimensional characters. So don't come to this book expecting social realism, depth of character, straightforward plot, A, B, C, linear plotting, whether it's twist or there's a first act. And it's not that kind of book at all. It wouldn't even try to be. And would kind of at times even rips into those kind of books. It's a postmodern novel that plays with is very playful and doesn't have a pretense. And it also jumps around in time. There are a lot of anachronisms in the book. Total anachronisms that have not, it's set in the 20s, but then he starts talking about things that are happening in the 70s and the 60s. And I know you read you heard the Audible version, but if you read the book, it has a lot of pictures in it. It's kind of partly a graphic novel. It's a little ahead of its time in that way. And a lot of the photos have nothing to do, logically with what's happening in the plot. he'll show black militants in the 60s after we just talked about something that happened in the 20s. Those are a lot of the photos.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, that is one major thing that when I told you I was listening to the audiobook, you were like, that will be very interesting to see the differences there, because what I am grateful that I listened to the audiobook, because I think what I got was the straight text. And I think that everything that you're talking about is very interesting. And of course, I've already ordered the print version on Amazon. It'll be arriving at my new apartment shortly. But I'm kind of grateful that I was able to get just the text. And in an audiobook, they don't pause for breath when they move on to a new section. So there are these great points where Reed will leave notes at the end of chapters, or there will be kind of newspaper headlines, and they all sort of run together. And it was a very interesting listening experience to be like, okay, cool, I'm in a different headspace now. I'm being shown something else. I don't know what it is yet. He goes so far as to do that, I think, with characters, though, too. I think he breaks a rule that I normally ding people on when I edit manuscripts, where he won't tell you who's talking for a very long time.
Oh, he does that.
And then you find out later on.
I know.
But to say all that, it's also not a difficult novel. It's not difficult to read at all, or listen to in my case.
I agree with you. First of all, it's very funny, so that always makes things easier. It's not long. It's not in that sense. It's a challenging novel. You really have to engage with it, but it's not a difficult novel. It's not an off-putting novel. I think, just to give a little background too, just to like one last thing. I think it is, because I think it's worth noting. It came out in 1972. Ishmael Reed is still alive. He's 81 years old. He's still writing. He's written a number of novels. He's also a great essayist. He really is a great. He's written a lot of essays, books, collections of essays. This is a book that's never been out of print since it came out, ever. Some of his other books have come and gone out of print, like most books. This has never been out of print. Thomas Pynchon name drops Ishmael Reed by name in Gravity's Rainbow, for Pynchon fans. He has a whole thing about secret societies or something, and then he actually says in the text in Gravity's Rainbow, check out Ishmael Reed. He knows a lot more about this stuff than I do.
That's amazing. I did not know that. That's fucking so cool.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It's amazing. And what's his name? Who's the guy? We talked about this recently. Who's the guy who just died, Mr. White, the so-called white male, the great white male critic?
Oh gosh.
You know who I'm talking about, who just died. He died a few months ago. Everybody was talking about him. He is, the Western canon. And
oh gosh, I don't know. I wish I could remember. It's slipping my mind. But maybe I can find it and link it or something.
I'll find it. But anyway, in his 500 greatest books of Western civilization, and most of them are white males. He has some women in there too. He mentions this book as one of the absolute essential texts of Western civilization, of the Western canon.
Right.
So it's a book that has a real. At this point, this will be a book that Ishmael Reed's remembered by. I think that's fair to say.
Do you? And I know I kind of started the plot and then I dropped it off, and then we started talking about other things. But I feel like, can you talk a little bit about Ishmael Reed biographically? Do you know enough to kind of? I'm assuming you do, because you wrote this article. But can you tell us more about the guy?
I know a little bit about him. He grew up, I think, primarily in I think it's Oakland. It's either Buffalo. I forgot if it's Buffalo or Oakland. But he basically started his career in the 60s, and he was very big with a certain kind of movement called kind of formulated this theory called the sort of neo-hoodoo movement. Okay. He was a poet, and basically he always sought to sort of he grew up basically in Buffalo. I'm just remembering that.
Yeah.
He went to the University of Buffalo, and then he later settled, in Oakland, and he taught for many years, like 30 years, a long, long time in Berkeley, California, at the University of Berkeley. So,
he was in Berkeley when he wrote this book, because the book ends with an epigraph that's signed from Berkeley. So he was there in the 70s. So he's got to have been there forever. And I think didn't he write a memoir about walking around Oakland? I think I
Yeah,
saw that
yeah.
while I was
Right,
perusing.
yeah. He
So
lived for a long.
basically, like, full disclosure, I have currently purchased about 7 Ishmael Reed books that are on the way because I'm doing a deep dive. Also, side note, the critic is Harold Bloom.
Harold Bloom, right, right.
Yeah.
That's it. So I mean, I was impressed when I read that. Harold Bloom is maybe might be a little over exaggerated. It's not all white there, but when I saw that, I was like, holy shit! Even Harold Bloom like recognized
Yeah.
the brilliance of
Yeah.
this book.
It's kind of
You know?
undeniable. Okay,
Right.
cool. So to get back to the plot, so there is this thing called Jes Grew that is possessing people and making them do crazy things like
Mhm.
dance and use
And
slang and
actually enjoy life.
actually enjoy life. So that does not sit well with the bad guys. So
Right.
the bad guys here um, are essentially Knights Templars. And this is where, when I said that you recommended this book to me and it was right up my alley, about halfway, not even halfway, about a quarter of the way through the book, you begin to discover that Harold von Winkle, the bad guy,
Von Vampton, yeah.
Von Van
Vampton.
is that what it
Yeah.
is? Is that
Yeah,
Winkle
yeah,
von
yeah.
Vampton? Winkle von
Yeah,
gosh.
and he's based on a real person, Carl Van Vechten. A lot of these people are
Oh,
actually based on
interesting.
real people. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So totally fucked that up. Cool.
No, it's
but but anyway, so he's being spied on by his maids, and he's standing on this doll of a dog and doing these sort of strange rituals, and you find out very quickly that he's about 1,000 years old. He's a Knights Templar from the 11th
right.
century,
Right.
and they have been sort of covertly based on this extensive Egyptian mythological background, they have kind of been in direct opposition to the Jes Grew kind of not virus, but the
Right.
thing, right? I want to say that it's split between Osiris and Set. How
Well,
about
the
we
thing
just
is,
say
but
that?
I think the thing that's important to point out is that whole explanation, the Egyptian explanation, doesn't come until at least 2/3 of the way through the book. A
Right.
good way through the book. So for most of the book, you see a lot of things going on, and you hear about. It's true, the Knights Templar, and it turns out that von Vampton has been around at least since the year like 1181,
Mm-hmm.
and his main sort of opponent, Papa Labas, who's this black occult detective. He's of indeterminate age also. You're not quite sure like how old he is. So you see all of this stuff happening, and you do hear about secret societies and the Knights Templar, but you don't know anything about that whole Egyptian explanation, at all until
Mm-hmm.
well into the book. So
Right.
you're
I
kind
think
of
I
like,
think the
what?
first time I talked to you, I thought that he was astrally projecting into the body of a Knights Templar because that was the best explanation I could come up with before I
Right.
had actually finished the book.
But
And then when you get to it, you're like, no, he's the same guy.
is the thing. The villains, so to speak, are basically, and it's essentially the Jes Grew carriers, the people who carry the virus, versus
The JGCs.
the JGCs, and the people trying to repress them are basically the Atonists, Atonists, and I had to do some research myself for that.
Yeah, I did too. I Googled Atonists and it came up as like, this temple of Aten, like the
Right.
worship of the sun.
Worship
It all
of the
makes sense
sun.
when you get to it. It all makes sense when you get
Which
to
does
it.
go back to ancient Egypt. The first like monotheist supposedly was Akhenaten, who
Hmm.
worshipped the sun, one of the Egyptian pharaohs. But his take on the Atonists is, first of all, it's hilarious because he goes through the book and he takes down Sigmund Freud, another Atonist. John
Dude,
Milton, he absolutely rips into John
extensively,
Milton and Paradise Lost like nothing you've ever read.
but he goes deep on Freud. The whole epilogue
He
is basically just taking a
yes.
big shit on Sigmund
He
Freud.
takes a big shit. I add Ishmael Reed to the authors. Nabokov is one. I know Roald Dahl is another one who absolutely loathes Sigmund Freud. I know.
Yeah. Which is very interesting. Thinking about different ways that I can kind of approach this, I feel like that's maybe what are the many, so this is kind of a tough question. What's Reed doing here? What are like and there are about 15 things I think that he's doing here. So you'll be excused
If I don't mention
if you
all
don't
of
name
them.
all of them. But what are some major sort of things that jump out? So I
Okay.
think people have a basic gist of the plot. You know, there's also people who there's a subplot about folks who are attempting to steal indigenous artifacts and return them to their homelands.
It's a group called the Motherfuckers, right?
Yeah, the Mutafikas.
The Mutafikas, right? They're liberating art, isn't that what it's called or something?
They're liberating art from what is called the Center of Art Detention,
which are essentially museums where the Western world, like the United States and Britain and so on, have taken art out of African countries, and the Guggenheim or the Museum of Natural History, these are centers of art detention. That's what they're called in the book.
Right? There's also subplots about possession. Somebody gets possessed by a Loa, which goes into the voodoo stuff. There's kind of extensive amounts of time with the villain and his Peter Lorre-esque sidekick, Safecracker Gould, right? Hubert
Safecracker Gould.
They're basically like they're trying to find something called a talking android, and the talking android is essentially going to be a black person, probably a black man, who can completely undermine Jes Grew by essentially being really lame. Right. By talking some sense into everybody. So we have about 18 threads already that we could follow. And which ones stand out? When you think of Mumbo Jumbo, what comes to mind first?
To me, the main two things that come to mind right off the bat, having read it, thought about it, are it essentially critiques and twists the common conception of history, and it reinterprets, that's a better word, it reinterprets history from an Afrocentric point of view. That's not necessarily not an anti-white sense point of view, but an Afrocentric point of view. That's number one, because he has a very key part in there. It's really funny to read, the way he describes it, where at one point Papa Labas, at some point in the past, met Sigmund Freud, and a few times Papa Labas was pursuing Sigmund Freud to talk to him, try to impart some knowledge to him, and Sigmund Freud kept blowing him off.
Yeah.
And the narrator essentially says, which was a big loss to Sigmund Freud, who was too dumb to recognize what he was being told. He was talking to someone really who had a lot to offer here, a lot to tell him.
Yeah.
So that already is an idea, it's because everything, that we've been, you generally read, in traditional, conventional kind of literature is the other way around. It's Freud or that kind of person would be the person of wisdom. Here it's Freud's loss that he didn't listen to Papa Labas. So that's one thing. It's sort of reinventing or reinterpreting history from, and that is consistent with returning the art to its rightful places, this kind of thing.
I also I like that you mentioned that white people aren't necessarily the villains. So in the book, I mean, white people do horrible things in the book, and they are kind of terrible. But one thing that Reed seems very concerned with is that white people, they're more cartoonish in their villainry. He's sort of very against this kind of misery porn.
Let me just connect it to that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay.
The other thing, and I think that relates to sort of what you're saying, in that it's not an anti-white book per se, is it's very, very strongly against the idea, which is pervasive in Western civilization, certainly, of the belief in one. It's a complete attack on monotheism, this book, number one. That's for sure. Totally. Any kind of monotheism, whether it's most of Western civilization, monotheism is Christianity, obviously, but he has a character in here who's also based on a real person. I mean, I did some research on this. Abdul Hamid.
Yeah. That's he just switched the names around, right? That's yeah.
That's the name that this guy takes. He's a black Muslim in Harlem in the 1920s, and he's based on somebody who was real named Eugene Brown, who was a virulent black Muslim anti-Semite in New York. He was very well known at the time in the 1920s. You can look him up, as they say. But Abdul Hamid's also something of a phony, because when he's not like in public yelling and screaming about things, he talks like a normal person to Papa Labaz, and he calms down and stuff. But so but Abdul Hamid is kind of ridiculed, in his sort of belief system. It's the same kind of strict, rigid, regimented. He happens to be Muslim. It could be Christian. And he keeps contrasting that kind of thinking with essentially Vodun and a belief in the Loas, and there are many Orishas, and there are many gods. And when he gets into the Egyptian sort of thing at that long explanation, he really makes it hammers home that point of like there was one side that wanted one god, and the other side that was accepting of nature and many gods. So that's a major point. And he carries that over into the political sphere, if you want to say, when he rips into Marxism, because he essentially says at one point, Marxists, communists, they basically took, Christianity and just transferred it to religion, to politics. They still believe in one. They still believe in the one. This is the only way. That's a major part of the book, is this attack on the idea of one, the one supreme. And that's a very repressive, atheistic view of the world, and that's a key part, I think, of what he rips into. Then the oneness manifests itself in different ways. Sigmund Freud's a manifestation of that. He has his theory. This is how everything is. It's one way. Because he mentions Jung a few times a little more positively. Jung is kind of a different thing.
Right. Which he is, yeah. I mean, if you look at it historically, Jung is very different. I mean, Jung and Freud broke off from each other.
They broke off.
Jung saw Freud as a mentor, and then they got to a certain point where, they could no longer communicate because
Jung had a little Jes Grew in him, and Freud.
He had a lot of Jes Grew in him, dude. Yeah, he certainly did. Yeah. Jung is like a based Freud, basically. But it's interesting, this whole idea of oneness. I think that one of the ways that Abdul becomes sort of one of the main figures of misguided villainy in the book is towards the end. Another major point of the book is that they're all looking for this Book of Thoth that is kind of the origination of Jes Grew. It's this kind of arcane, esoteric screed that has been passed down from generation to generation. And so essentially, I guess spoiler alert here for people who want to read the book, but Abdul essentially burns the book because he feels like the ideas inside of it are too dangerous, and the narrator takes time to excoriate him for doing that, where he says Abdul made the key error of deciding what was best for other people.
I don't know, was it Abdul who burned the book, or was it Hinkle? Because Abdul had buried the book, and Hinkle found it under the in a certain place, and burned it. It wasn't Hamid who burned it.
I'm pretty sure it was. No, I'm pretty sure he ended up. I'm pretty sure that. So, Buddy Jackson found it, and he's the one who decided to take it out of that circulation that it was in.
Right. But Hamid, remember when when Papa Labas gets to the scene of the crime and finds Hamid murdered. Hamid had left a clue as to where he buried the book.
But didn't he also? I think that when they eventually find a letter that's addressed to Papa Laba, after all this is done, he's reading the letter, and it's in that letter from Hamid that was written right before his death that he said that he eventually burned it, just to be rid of it.
I gotta check it again. That's interesting. Yeah. See,
I'm pretty sure that's what happened. I'm pretty sure that he writes him a letter, then he gets murdered, and then there's this kind of ongoing gag throughout the book where it's like the mail is slow. Right. Oh, hey, here's your bills. The mail is slow, and there's a point. It's after I think it's after the kind of Egyptian mythology bit towards the very, very end. He finally gets Hamid's letter in the mail, and he's like, look, I decided to just like to burn I don't know if he burned the original or if he burned his version, or I don't know. We'll have to go back on that.
We gotta check on that. The thing, but that's it could be either way though. It's important to know that's another key part of the book though, because he mentions very early on maybe on page 3, I mean really early in the book, that Jes Grew is in search of a text. So this is very much also a very, in that sense, it's a very, that's another area where it's like a very postmodern book. It's about the search, you know, for a text. It's really about like people trying to, and in the end, the text is not found, but Jes Grew continues even without its text, you know, even without its, which again, it ties into like, you know, so many people live by the text, the word. This is a spirit that's going to live on without a text, right? You know, you have Bible literalists and Muslim, you know, Islamic literalists. You can't be literal when there's not even a text. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of so the like you said, the division between these sort of nature, spirit, voodoo people, and anybody who's monotheistic is essentially the bad guy here.
Yeah.
And with that, all you mentioned, there's a point early on in the book where Hamid is talking to Black Herman and Labah at a party, and he's yelling at them and, you know, acting very surly. And then as soon as everybody's outside of the room, he's like, "Look, guys."
He calms down.
Yeah, he's like, "I don't think that you're bad guys, but listen, the world is moving in this certain direction, and if we want Black people to be able to survive in this, they have to be able to have things like discipline." So he's like, so all the misogyny and things like that I talk about all this time, like all of that is in service of just keeping people on a straight and narrow path. And I think that Reed has nothing but contempt for that. Right?
No, I agree with you completely. No. That kind of sort of like to keep people on the straight and narrow, we have to. And he has contempt for that, and no matter what form it could be, any kind of person, white, black, whatever. That sort of thinking, he loathes. No, there's no doubt about that. Right.
Yeah. And he loathes it. And these are people who get a lot of hate from Mr. Ishmael Reed. He hates the critics. He hates the modern art scene. He thinks that they are these sort of keepers of this sort of Atonists. Like art has to be this one sort of way. You have to read classics. You can't be this, that, or the other. There's a lot. I got to a point in the book about 2/3 of the way through where I'm like, oh, he's kind of pausing the narrative to talk about these critics who he hates, but specifically Black critics who he views as sellouts, right?
Right.
He seems to have a special kind of ire for not necessarily white people who don't get it, but Black people who get it, but choose to sort of still go after these things in order to advance.
Well, he has a couple of targets here, and he, you know, the more you read of him, the more you see these are common targets. Like the Hinkle von Vempten character is based on a real white literary critic at the time, Carl van Vechten, who was very influential. You look him up, he's got a long thing on Wikipedia even. He was really involved very highly in arts of the time, and he was very active in the Harlem Renaissance era, promoting Black writers. Actually, he really was. But that's sort of like, you know, I'm a friend of the Black world, if you want to put it that way. Reed really, like, you know, kind of digs, kind of ridicules here. And at the same time, you're right, like the sort of person who is Black but kind of makes, you know, cozies up to sort of the white literary or arts world bourgeoisie to make progress, to make hay. He really has contempt for, and he has some examples of that in this. He even goes into more examples of that in other books, but he has some examples of that in this book, like with the talking android is essentially is essentially that. It's funny. Like, I think, was it the talking android who, when he goes for the sort of work interview, says like, I read all 494 articles by Karl Marx. And he said, this guy's perfect because, you know, he believed this guy's perfect because he believes in the one. We can convert him to our cause because he's clearly someone who's going to be like, put him on a path, you just go straight at it, you know, like a dog to a bone.
Yeah. Right? So that's Woodrow Wilson Jefferson, who is kind of this cowpoke who decides he's going to leave his farm life behind.
Or wherever he's from.
Right. which that comes to a very amusing conclusion, by the way. And I was surprised that like that was just the conclusion of his arc, right?
Right.
So he basically moves to the city because he wants to meet Marx and Engels, right?
Right.
Those are his favorite writers,
Yeah.
and he's kind of mocked because he doesn't know that they're dead at that point. But he is hired by the villain, whose name keeps escaping me, Von Winkle?
Von Vampton. Yeah.
Von Vampton.
Hinkle von
Gosh,
Vampton.
Hinkle von Vampton. Why is that so hard for me? I don't know. Von Vampton. So he's hired by him for his magazine called The Benign Monster, which is sort of like the Vice News of its time. It's very kind of scandalous. He started this newspaper. I was a little unclear about why exactly it had to be racy and all these kind of things. It was an Atonist magazine, but it also seemed kind of edgy. So I don't know if that necessarily
Yeah, that's a good question.
But
maybe he was trying to seduce people through that to get them to read it and then get the real message in. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question, though.
Yeah. So they hire this guy because they need somebody on staff who's black, who can write for them, who can, say all these things that they can't say as white people. But then they want him to be the talking android. But then there's a problem because, WW is too black, basically.
Right.
So they think about giving him some skin lightening cream because they kind of want, and that ends up coming to a very hilarious kind of head at the end of it when they need a talking android, or Von Vampton's going to be kind of murdered by his co-conspirators. And so they actually go with Safecracker to be
Safecracker Gould, right? They put him.
They put him in blackface to be the talking android. So there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Right.
And I think it's worth tying in, and I can link this in the show notes. It's worth tying in that LitHub article you sent me, the essay that Reed actually wrote about an author called Charles S. Wright, and a lot of space in that article is kind of devoted to sort of the difference between this Charles S. Wright character, who was in most ways was very similar to James Baldwin, right?
Right. They were alive at the same time and writing at the same time, like you're talking about in the 60s now, right?
Yeah,
basically.
Right. But how Wright was sort of a character who would hang out with alcoholics and drug addicts, who was himself an alcoholic and drug addict, and James Baldwin.
And they were both in supporting. I think he draws Wright as a comparison too, because they both were around the same time. They both were bisexual, so they both had this sort of fluid sexuality. Right. And he points out, like, this is something that only someone like Ishmael Reed or maybe a black writer of some kind could get away with, because he wrote this in 2019, so it's very recent. He's 81. He's still angry. He writes this article. I love the way he starts the article. Like, Baldwin says, he doesn't even like make any introduction. He just like gets into it. But I think, tell me if you agree with me, part of the gist of that article is he basically draws a comparison between, he doesn't get into the writing quality per se, but James Baldwin, he basically has very little good to say about James Baldwin, which is, horror of
Which,
horror.
if I'm not mistaken, Baldwin and Wright were both his friends, right?
Right.
They all knew each other, but he's kind of writing. It kind of feels like something that he was maybe hinting at in Mumbo Jumbo. Now that he's 81 and everybody's kind of dead, he's sort of letting it fly in this essay. He's letting it fly.
And I think the gist of it is kind of like, essentially James Baldwin made, kind of a pact, if you want to put it that way, in order to get where he got in terms of fame and success, he had to cozy up to the white literary world. There's no other way he would have got where he got if he hadn't sort of made, sort of cozied up and made nice with the white literary bourgeoisie. And Charles Wright never did that. You want to say that phrase that we were talking about, that's so funny, like when success, he has this phrase where he says, like, Charles Wright was the kind of writer, when success came knocking at his door, he was never home.
Yeah.
But James Baldwin was. He was always home when success came. He's always there to let people in and give them tea and have a drink and be nice. And surprise, surprise, he was very successful and everybody idolized him. And very few people even know who Charles Wright is anymore. And it's not because one was a better writer than the other, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think that the kind of vitriol comes through in that article very clearly. he seems extremely frustrated with this idea that there's still this hierarchy involved, and whether or not you are, involving people of color or people who are not, straight white males in this sort of world, there's still this kind of code that people seem to they have to become talking androids in a sense. So I think his talking android all the way back in 1972, that's what he was saying back then too. He was saying, why is nobody paying attention to these people who are, at least to him, and probably I would venture to say to you and I, more interesting. But why are we paying attention to these other people? Still good, great writers.
Yeah.
But why do we want people who toe the line? Why do we want people who do this thing the way that the establishment says that it should be done? Why do we care? We get why the establishment cares.
But why do we care?
Why do we care? Right. That's a very interesting question.
Yeah. No, it really is. I think there were hints in this book. There were lines in this book, like I just opened up to one, just to give an example, where he gives an indication of kind of what stands against sort of the things that he doesn't like. Like he has a little passage here in Harlem, I guess. The interracial revelers are having a good time. Langston Hughes, writing of this period, said, "We liked people of any race who smoked incessantly, drank liberally, wore complexion and morality with loose garments, made fun of those who didn't do likewise." So you kind of, you get where he's coming from.
Oh yeah, 100%. That's a great passage to exemplify what we're talking about.
He doesn't like that kind of rigidity, and that's important to point out. Race is a big thing with him in terms of why history's distortions, but it's not an anti this or anti that in that sense, and that passage kind of exemplifies that.
And we can take that all the way up till today. We can take that up today with people who are very quote unquote woke on social media, who kind of say all the right things, who have the right skin tone and, sort of play these parts. But you can kind of see behind all of it and realize that their politics are not particularly radical. And besides all that, getting rid of all the politics and all of the saying the correct words, whatever, a lot of these people just don't strike me as particularly fun human beings to hang out with. Reed seems to be like, why can't we all just have a good time?
Well, I think I've read this in other things that he's read too, one way or another. He definitely doesn't really respect people who can't appreciate a joke or laugh.
Right. Yeah.
That's a sign. It's not just that you don't have a sense of humor. I mean, that would be, but that's a sign of a kind of almost moral deficiency. If you can't laugh at a lot of things, it means that you're seeing things in too narrow a way. I think, in part, is what Ishmael Reed is saying.
Right.
Another part, like you were talking before about, that's sort of like this sort of, misery porn. That a lot of, he has a whole passage in here where he said, like, one thing I think he gets at, and it's connected to fiction, is he talks in Mumbo Jumbo. There's some passage where he mentions something about all of the suffering and injustice of history have made a lot of black people and black men and stuff, and black people bitter and angry. With good reason. Understand.
With good reason, sure. Yeah.
But it's taken away a sense of humor. It's taken away lightness. It's taken away liveliness. When it comes to art, how does that translate? He has this thing where he talks about, and you could see his contempt for a certain kind of writing. It translates into, like, everybody is writing in this. He mentions it. He says specifically, it turned everybody into social realists, and you just got the image of a black man on a stoop in misery with his head in his hands, sitting looking miserable. That's the image that has pervaded through history, and that's what that. And he kind of criticizes black people for, like, buying into that image, and writers and artists who, like, there's only one kind of real, like, African American art, black art, and that has to be the art of social realism, misery, we suffer, it's terrible. And Mumbo Jumbo and his books in general are kind of an answer to that. Of course you can be angry, and of course you can talk about all the shit that's happened, but you don't have to toe the line aesthetically in this very simplistic, straightforward, traditional boring way. That I think
And
is
I
partly
wonder,
what he's saying.
and I wonder if you contrast the idea of, we'll just go with misery porn because it's an easy
Yeah.
term to use. If you contrast misery porn with something like Jes Grew. So Jes Grew is the good guy in this book, basically.
Right.
And it is that kind of lively spark amongst particularly Black culture that leads to innovation, leads to great art, great music, all of these things, right? And so it's almost interesting that what he's saying, especially when you take the Jes Grew, you take the talking android, you take everything that you just said, when you focus specifically on Black people's pain is kind of the only thing of those three things that I just mentioned that white people had a hand in. So in a way, the misery stuff is a way to relate to white people because it's including them in this dichotomy of the story itself.
Right.
And when you take white people out, when you do something that's entirely in slang, that is completely particular to Black culture, when you talk about, jazz, all these things that, and of course there were white people who were interested in these things, but you see where I'm going with this.
But I think you hit the nail on the head, because I found that passage, and you're exactly right, I think, because his point is, it's a passage where he's talking about, at one point, Papa Labas winds up in this sort of room, and there's all of this original African sculpture in the room, and he's looking at it. Right. And he talks about how these sculptures, which ostensibly are from Africa, are hilarious.
Are funny. This was in Hamid's room. This is in Hamid's room.
Yeah, it's in Hamid's room, right? Which shows Hamid is not a complete asshole, basically. That's true. Right. Yeah. The African race had quite a sense of humor. In North America, under Christianity, many of them had been reduced to glumness, depression, surliness, cynicism, malice without artfulness. And their intellectuals, this is the point, and their intellectuals in America only appreciated heavy, serious works. They'd really fallen in love with tragedy. Their plays were about bitter, raging members of the nuclear family. And their counterpart in art was exemplified by the contorted, grimacing, painful social realist face. Somebody, head in hand, sitting on a stoop. Oh, Lord! That's what he writes. Exactly. Yeah. But before that, in Africa, it wasn't like life was heaven on earth, but the art produced had a lot of humor before it got crushed down. And this is the result of what we see now,
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that people have when they talk about issues of appropriation, which we don't have to get too deep into, I'm just bringing it up to bring up the idea that, I've heard this said by very many smart writers. If a white person wants to write a science fiction book about space aliens, okay, go right ahead. But when a Black person wants to write a book about space aliens, the publishers ask them, so can this be about somebody who's talking to space aliens and also about what it's like to be Black? Right. Yeah, right.
So there's always this kind of. Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany were asked that question. So you're right.
Of course they were. Because the whole thing is that this white publishing establishment is very much concerned with, okay, so how do we continuously relate this black, talk about a Freudian slip. There we go. Relate this back to white people. And that's what Reed's getting at. I really do think that that's what Reed's getting at. He's like, if you have to cut that out completely and get to this kind of creative source of just joy. There are plenty of white novels written by white people. I almost said white novels. That sounds gross. But novels written by white people that are about whatever the hell they want to write about. And that's great. That's awesome. Right. That's fantastic. Black people have to get to that point too, is what Reed is saying. And every time they try to, they're kind of stamped out by these tragedy narratives.
Yeah. No, I think, I know that's a recurring theme, I think, in his criticism. Like, there's a reason. I guess there are many reasons, but one thing I got from like the piece in Lit Hub about Baldwin and Charles Wright, because at the end of the piece, he has a good anecdote about Richard Pryor, who apparently Ishmael Reed knew pretty well, it seems like, from what he's talking about.
He gave him the boot.
He said,
get the fuck out of here.
That's what he said. Which is something, I know. And Richard Pryor seemed like he had respect, he had a lot of respect for him. But he mentions how like he basically says Charles Wright was doing Richard Pryor in books before Richard Pryor did Richard Pryor, which we got to read Charles Wright to see, but that's high praise.
I bought the collective novel.
I know, I'm going to order it tomorrow.
I will be the judge of that. Ooh, look at me. Look out, everybody. JDO is going to have an opinion.
But I think he's contrasting, at that level at least, Baldwin, who is more into the serious, sort of, he's more than a man sitting on a stoop, obviously, head in his hand. I don't think Ishmael Reed would say that, but he does represent a kind. You think of Baldwin, you think serious, on the basic level. And Charles Wright sounds like he's clearly serious, but he's very funny. And if he compares him to Pryor, he's got to be. And I think he's getting, that's another recurring theme, is like how, like you said, how the art has this has to be changed. It's not always about, he caught a lot of flack at one point, Ishmael Reed, he had almost like a kind of feud going with Alice Walker, who he really didn't like at all.
Wow.
I don't think.
Okay. All right.
Some of it was because, from what I understand, from what I've read, I remember it a little bit at the time, was, as he saw it, rightly or wrongly, but there was this whole, like, the white, let's put it this, the sort of white literary establishment, feminist literary establishment, was very like, let's get on board with like Alice Walker, because in particular, she's really beating up on black men. And Ishmael Reed was like, you're just like making, I think he called those writers like yellow writers, like she's black, but she's
right.
They're sort of like, making their reputation and getting all this success specifically on the backs of a certain group, and they're doing it by like palling up to, the white literary establishment, which is what promoted her.
Right.
That doesn't mean the book's good or bad. I don't know if but he's taken some pretty gutsy stands, like them or not, over the year, and fought with everybody and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. So we are now at 50 minutes. I'm going to say that this will be the end of part 1. Are you down to talk more about the book?
Okay.
Are you down to talk more?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because I can just.
We got to talk about how, at the very least, remind us. Did you have any idea, last thing, when you read this book, that it was a common rumor at the time that Warren Harding might be black, and he was like, maybe he was the first black president before Barack Obama? Did you know that before you read this?
I did not know that, but let's leave that as a teaser.
Yes, let's leave that as a teaser.
And we will see you next week. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the JDO show. I'm your host, J. David Osborne, here with Scott Adlerberg for part 2 of our conversation about Ishmael Reed's novel, Mumbo Jumbo. Hey, Scott. How's it going?
Hello. Good. So, pause to get a little wine. I'm fine. Everything's good.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to perk up.
Right.
Yeah, that's something that nobody has ever said to Scott Adlerberg. You need to have a little bit more energy, I think. So last time when we left off, that whole week ago.
It was a long time ago. I'm trying to remember if I can even remember the book anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, I know, it's been a while. Yeah. You were talking about Harding and something that now I think that I might have seen this somewhere in many of the conspiracy theory texts that I read, but I'd never kind of paid it any attention. But if you would like to, you can, for the listeners, let them know what exactly it is that Reed via Mumbo Jumbo posits about President Harding.
Well, in the book, which was obviously written well before Barack Obama was on the scene, he talks about how there was this theory, very apparent, because again, I did some research after reading this. I had no idea when I read the book, that it was a common rumor in the 1920s when Warren Harding was president that he had a black ancestor and essentially had some black blood in him, which would, in theory, would make him the first black president. Because if you have any black blood in this country,
you're black.
You're black.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was some rumor that not that far back, maybe I forgot if it's a grandparent or great grandparent, that someone in his family had sexual relations with someone black, and that led directly down to him. And in the book, I mean, no one ever, I don't know if there's anyone who thinks all that highly of Warren Harding as a president. It seems like he was a pretty easygoing guy, but corrupt, not a great president, right?
Mm-hmm,
Or his administration, at least, was corrupt, not a great president. In the book, he says, like, he has somebody ask Warren Harding about this, and Harding's like, yeah, maybe, whatever, I wouldn't be surprised. So what?
Yeah. He basically does say that in the book. He's like, I've heard that, but I don't really think about it. So who cares?
It's possible that whatever it was, my grandfather jumped over the fence that one day and, essentially like had sex with someone. I don't know. I don't think about it much. That's okay.
Yeah. Which is kind of interesting because the book does play into all this sort of political intrigue, and the theme is still obviously Jes Grew versus Atonists. Where does Harding fall as far as the novel is concerned?
Well, Harding, I guess he has to come down on the side of the Atonists because he's sort of he is the president and he sort of like oversees what's is aware of what's going on. He doesn't seem as much of a hard ass though as Woodrow Wilson, who or Calvin Coolidge, I guess, who comes after him, who's more straight, because he has Harding like coming to Harlem and he's hanging out at a party, speakeasy for a while, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he does.
Yeah. He seems like kind of a party person, so he doesn't seem that bad, really, which I think was Harding's reputation, actually. But I don't know if he ever came to Harlem and hung out, but he was like, pretty live and let live. Mm-hmm. But I think after that, he sort of exits the scene, and you've got Coolidge, and he clearly doesn't think much of Woodrow Wilson because he's got a character, named Woodrow Wilson Jefferson, who's,
Yeah, well, he's got that Jefferson thrown in too, just to make it that little extra knife twist,
Jefferson
right?
Thrown in there.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, some Sally Hemings angles there.
Absolutely, yeah.
But so that's kind of interesting where, you have Harding who falls on the side of the Atonists, and I wonder if this isn't, I don't know if it's gross or not, but is it maybe the fact that, this is an ostensibly white president who might have had a little bit of black blood inside of him, is this kind of Atonist figure. Does that kind of tie into how Reed feels about black folks who go over to quote unquote the white side? Might be reaching there, but I don't know if that might be symbolic of that, or if it's just this guy's mind at work. It seems like a brain that can't be turned off. So there is that kind of thing too.
I think I don't think it's more that, and I think it's also in line with, maybe that was fairly like a not completely unknown rumor at the back in the 20s, but it's clearly not that well known now. And I think part of this novel, in a way, I could see why Pynchon loves Ishmael Reed. There are some similarities there.
Oh, definitely.
And one of them is, and connected to the Warren Harding thing, is Ishmael Reed really relishes not just, reinterpreting history, but exploring like these little unknown things of history. And I think that's one of them. I think at least in part, he's like, this country thinks it's this, and this. At one point, a lot of people thought that we actually had a black president. I mean, it'd be interesting to see, this is written well before Obama, but it's like the fact that he puts that in, I think is a sign of like, there are a lot of historical things that nobody knows about. They get buried, they get forgotten. And this is kind of an anti-historical book in that sense. Or not anti, but alternate history is a better way to put it. Mm-hmm. I think he really gets into that a lot.
And I think that as far as the anti-history angle of the book goes, I think I think the lack of fidelity to what we know of as fact is pretty important there too, because I do think there's oh man, I'm hoping that I remember this correctly. There's something in the epilogue. So in the epilogue, Papa LaBosse given a talk to student. He's like 100 and something years old. He's very old. We've jumped to the 70s. He's kind of talking to them.
Let me just at the end of the book, they don't find the text, the Jes Grew text. It was either burned. It was burned. We know that. That's for sure. It's destroyed. And the Jes Grew virus, which was a big fear, in the 20s dies down. So it appears that the 8 myths have completely won. I mean, that's the context.
Right. Which is funny because the book then the book jumps us to the 70s, and people are kind of avidly listening to Papa LaBeouf talk about all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And it's this idea that like, oh, it's coming back. That's the gist.
Right. And this is after like the militant 60s, the Black Panthers and everything else. So by that point, it wouldn't be a stretch to say maybe the Jes Grew is black. There's certainly more black consciousness in the world than there was, at that point, right? There's a big movement for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there's a point where he's accosted at the end by this person who I guess stands on a soapbox outside of the university, and he's kind of the 70s version of a hotep. Have you heard of hoteps?
Right.
Do you know what these guys do? These hoteps are essentially black guys on the internet today who are essentially Alex Jones. They're very conspiracy theorist heavy. They are pretty misogynistic. But the whole idea, like, actually, now that I think about it, there's some kind of hotep vibes to this whole book, although this book is not anywhere nearly as like militant or nasty as those people are. But they might have read Mumbo Jumbo and taken away a lot of the wrong ideas, right? Right. So anyway, so this guy is yelling at people outside of the college about kind of what Hamid yells at them for. Like, they need discipline, they need to focus. And he accosts LaBeouf when he's getting into his 1919 Studebaker.
The locomobile that he drives.
The locomobile, yeah.
Loco, right.
Yeah. And he tells him, why are you filling their heads with all this nonsense? Like, they need to know the facts. They need to know how things actually happen. They need to, and he says something to the effect. I don't have the exact quote. This is one of the downsides of listening to an audiobook.
Let me take a look here.
He says something to the effect of the facts not necessarily like being the most important, that art should be free associative, that we should not be following a kind of, it should be like, that art should be like jazz, and that we should not be following these kind of strict rules about what you can and cannot do. Like when you're making art or when you're telling stories, that you have to associate that. And it kind of sums up the whole book at the end there, right? Because the book, when you hear LaBeouf say it, whatever it was, and I apologize for mangling that quote, but when you get to the end of it and you hear that quote, you realize that's what this whole book has been doing. There's a reason why that there's no strong character development, why people go. I remember the very first sort of long monologue happens with Hamid at that party, like 60 pages or so into the book, and it just becomes this point where you realize that it's not Hamid talking anymore, it's Reed writing an essay. And
he does that. Absolutely, right.
But that's kind of the free associative Jes Grew. The book itself is an act of Jes Grew.
Yes,
I would argue that.
I see what you're saying. Right, that's a good point. The book itself is, I mean, it would be very hard to it'd be extremely, it really wouldn't be much point, but it would, even if you were inclined, it would be very hard to pick this book apart in that way, because it's obviously extremely well put together and threaded. It's not that long. It's, 200 pages, a little over 200 pages, but it goes all over the place. It's tight, but it goes all over the place. It's structured tightly, but you can't really figure out what that structure is. It is kind of like Jes Grew in that sense. Right.
Where would the characters even go in this book? Where would you even and why would you even want to kind of follow them wherever they go?
Right.
Like it's a series of things happening, and there are certain points of the book where we follow Hinkle von Vampton. Got it right this time. We follow him for 10, 15 chapters. We follow the bad guy. Right. And then when we have the art heist, we follow that thread all the way to its conclusion. That doesn't really so to back up.
No, it's not that kind of a book. I mean, that's where the postmodernist angle. You would no more read this book for character development than you'd read a Pynchon novel, or you'd read a number of books from that period. It's something like, unless you read a lot of some of those books, very few people write that way anymore. I mean, it's really,
Yeah.
there are, not everything now is social realism. I mean, that's for sure. But most books, at least that I see or come across or read, do more or less develop character in a somewhat realistic way, if not a fully.
Yes.
And this is the kind of book, these books do not, don't do that. They just
They
don't
don't
do,
do
and he
it.
has no interest in doing that. And
He
he
has
even
no
makes
interest.
a
Yeah.
point of kind of ridiculing that social realist model in books that do that,
Yeah, and I think that my particular style of writing, with where I'm basically aping film, and I'm doing scene after scene, and I'm thinking, okay, how do I develop these characters? My early books were very much inspired by The Wire, so I wanted every scene to kind of have these kind of. Reading something like this blew my head off because I realized, oh, you don't need any of those things, right?
No,
I
not if
mean,
you're doing a lot of other stuff.
not if
Right.
you're doing a lot of other stuff, and it doesn't hurt to be as brilliant as Ishmael Reed, which we can't all be, but
Which we
at the
can't all be,
same
right.
time,
I think
we can. I feel like we can take something from this
we
as
could take,
writers.
right. He also makes it clear. I've never read what Ishmael Reed thinks of Pynchon. We know Pynchon loves Reed, but the names were like that. It's that kind of book. When you have names like Hinkle von Vampton and
Biff
Safecracker
Musselwhite.
Gould and Biff Musselwhite, you don't take those people as real people. I mean, obviously, like any of the Pynchon, Tyrone Slothrop and Stanley Fallopian, Stanley Kotex and Peter Fallopian. You don't. Of course not. I mean, that's
Right.
not the. But he makes that very clear from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's something to take away from it. I wish that we would see more novels like that these days that are largely unconcerned with things that quote unquote make a novel. I don't mean to take too much of a detour into this, but it is still a
But
writing
no, it is
podcast,
interesting,
right?
Because I was reading it, because I really love, I can't stress this enough. I love that the post, because I used to, it just as so happened, it's been a while since I read. But if you look at my bookshelves, Barth, Bartholomew, Pynchon, Coover, Rob, all those, I have a lot of those writers on I read a lot of them, and they're some of my favorite writers. It's just been a while since
you open up a book,
and it was great to read somebody like that again,
Yeah, because you open up a book these days and you're introduced to a small town cop, right? And you have to watch the small town cop go into his station and eat a donut and talk to his secretary and call his wife, who's telling him about how the begonias are doing in the garden, and then you cut over to the bad guy, and the bad guy is snorting meth off of a hooker's twat, and he's also sad, right? He's also really sad about something.
Right. The book, jumps around. I mean, a lot of books jump around, but there are different ways of jumping around in terms of setting. Of someone who's more realistically oriented, even books that are not quote realistic follow these templates like they do with the character development thing. They're essentially even some of the books I read that are more on the bizarro side, or even they essentially follow a logical template.
Right.
The events are weird and the characters, but the structure of the novel is a pretty conventional structure. Let's put it that way. And the language used more or less is conventional. It's more or less conventional. And the structure of the novel is the form. It doesn't challenge you with the form. Here, it's so free. One second, like you said, one second.
Free is the word.
He doesn't waste time jumping around. Right.
Well, it's free because once he stops being interested in something, he lets it go. Once he's said what he's had to say about a particular thing, it's over and done. And that is just so he has no fidelity to what is supposed to happen in a book.
Oh, right. Like this, we talked. There's a whole section we made a reference to it in our previous recording a week ago.
I don't even remember it. I don't even remember
if
that.
I can remember now, yeah. But we talked. There's a whole section here. No, it's a key. It's the maybe central section of the book, where after all these things have happened, he describes essentially the gist behind the mystery of what Jes Grew is, and he says a 40-page sort of 40-page explanation that dates back to ancient Egypt, and he reinvents the sort of Osiris versus Set myth.
Right.
And Osiris essentially is the god from which Jes Grew sprang. I guess you could boil it down to that. And Set, repressionist that he is the god from which the Atonist sprang and repression. So I'm just looking at like one of these passages, and he goes into this one passage. In one passage he talks of this is all in the context of a reinvented myth. Because it's a real myth, Osiris, Set, Isis, but he reinterprets it and reinvents it. Within that context, he has a paragraph here where he talks about Julian, the emperor of Rome, the last pagan
the apostate.
Emperor.
Yeah.
Right, Julian the apostate. From there, he goes into John Milton, and he's still talking about Set and Osiris in his own context of the myth This is all within like a half a page.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Who does something like that?
And then he doesn't stop. He goes from Osiris and Set to Moses, right?
Right.
He talks about how Moses was the first Bokor. And he makes a distinction between a Hungan, who's a kind of a real voodoo priest who's following the right-hand path, versus a Bokor, who's like a charlatan who follows the left-hand path. And he talks about how Moses is kind of, if it wasn't Von Vanten, it would be Moses who is the real bad guy of this novel, because Moses just he wants those secrets. So we can go into that a little bit and explain to the listeners what happens. So he tells the story of Osiris and Set, who are these brothers.
Papa Labasa tells it, right?
He does, yeah, because he's basically he's got his 22, his pearl-handled 22 pointed at Von Vanten, and everybody's like, what's the meaning of this?
And I just as a little background, I want to, because I'll talk anyone who, when that piece comes out on Crime Read, this is a major part of it. But basically, he investigates in the plot. There is a real mystery, and Ishmael Reed wrote it in part as a very unconventional detective story, and even called it that. And after they sort of make their arrests, he basically has a group of people around him, like in a conventional mystery. And they're like, what are you talking about? What's the explanation? And then he says, okay. And this is the explanation. Like, imagine Hercule Poirot had a 40-page explanation of the crime, and he started talking about some reinterpreted myth in ancient Egypt. That's essentially what happens here.
So fucking cool, man.
What
it's so fucking cool.
What is this guy talking about?
Oh man, that really clinched it. I was just as a personal side note, I was totally on board with the novel the whole way. And then when it made that left-hand turn, I opened up my Audible app to see how long the chapter was, and found that it was going to be an hour and 20 minutes. And I was like, fuck yes, he's going for it.
I did right. See, as he started going into that, I had the same experience like through the book. It goes on and on. I'm like, this is the fucking like mystery explanation in a mystery. This is unbelievable. 40 pages of this. Okay, and I actually wrote a note in the book. This is what he's telling the people sitting there. Is he explaining this?
Oh yeah, dude.
Yes,
it is. That's right. No, it's god damn. I can't explain how brilliant this shit is. But so he goes back and he tells this story of Osiris and Set. For people who don't know, I believe the way the more pedestrian narrative goes is that Set was a jealous brother of Osiris, who was the king who did marry Isis, who was both of their sisters. Weird.
Right. We know.
But the way that the basic story goes, it's actually less about Osiris and Set, and it's more about Horus, because Osiris gets essentially killed and mutilated by Set, and his body parts are spread all over the place. And then essentially, I think that in the original myth, I want to say that Isis finds his penis and impregnates herself. That's not how it happens.
Something
here.
Like that. I think you're
That's
right.
not how it happens here.
Yeah.
But I think that that's what happens there. And when she impregnates herself with his penis and gives birth to Horus, who ends up, overcoming Set, who's like more of the. I thought he was the god of the underworld, but here he seems to be more of a sun king, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly like the lines between what the I guess quote unquote actual mythology and the Reedian mythology are a little skewed for me. But Reed fucks that whole thing up anyway.
Yeah.
So
in
his do you want to tell it or do you want me to tell it?
No, you got it. No, in his I mean, in his version, Osiris Set essentially is like a petty tyrant after he's jealous of Osiris for a number of reasons, but Osiris essentially is
Cool.
connected to the earth and nature, and he kind of believes in many gods, basically. And Set's envious and jealous of him for many reasons, not the least of which is Isis likes Osiris more than she likes Set, right? I mean, that's part of it. And while Osiris, kind of is touring the world with his Nile Root Orchestra, he's like goes abroad and he's like, this is an
he's the reason why the Olmec heads exist and why like Aztec pyramids exist, because he's traveled all over these places and done his Jes Grew routine in front of all these
routine with his Nile Root Orchestra, bringing good music and good times and good vibes wherever he goes in the world. Set is back in Egypt, just like stewing and brewing,
just being a bitch.
Just being an ass, a total fucking asshole. You're right. That's it. And he's everything that represents repression. And he starts to lose his mind on top of it. And he starts worshiping the sun and making everybody else worship the sun. And there must only be one God. You cannot worship, So essentially, that's another big point. Is at that point, civilization, and it carries over to Western civilization, gets cut from its basic connection to nature. I think that's pretty important because he makes a point of that. When people believed in the gods, so to speak, and the later maybe the Loas, that connection to nature was cut. So the Western civilization is not an original thought per se, but that's something that Reed also sort of, it develops a little bit, I think, or a lot, right?
Right.
And from that point on, that's sort of when you have the split between the Atonists and the, and like most Atonists versus maybe the Jes Grew carriers, Set seems to be more. Would you agree with this? He's more disciplined and focused in his, his goal, because he has that kind of like repressive mindset. And while Osiris is off touring the world, he's collecting power. And
it's even less that that Set has it, but that he imposes it upon his followers. I think that's an important distinction. It's not necessarily that he's the most disciplined person ever, but that's what he preaches. That's what he wants everybody to kind of follow.
Fear and so on.
Yeah, right, exactly. So Osiris comes back. And in his travels, he has learned how to kind of perform this ritual where he becomes a seed, where he's buried underground for many, many days, which is an interesting callback to early in the novel when Black Herman, who's an esotericist, kind of the sidekick of Papa LaBeouf in this book.
He is, right.
He does mention very early in the book, he's like, oh, yeah, people were amazed because I showed them my trick where I bury myself alive for 8 days and then come back out. So it's just one of the many things that Reed does where there's payoffs if you're paying attention. But so Osiris has this trick and he decides to perform it in Egypt. Of course, Set has his followers unearth him while he's in his trance, mutilate him, spread his body everywhere. But the problem becomes, again, that idea of Osiris as a seed, which goes back to, the original myth of like the penis and, it containing seed and things like this. Wherever the mutilated pieces of Osiris go, Osiris himself kind of springs up in spiritual form and starts to like take over. Which, as a side note, to take kind of a detour here, within the mythology, this is something that I thought was really interesting because Isis mourns for Osiris by kind of like rending her garments and screaming, and Set is very concerned with her mourning properly. And Reed also takes a detour there and talks about how, Black women in particular, like mourn at funerals with a bunch of like screaming and all this kind of stuff. And how there's always been this polite society that's been like, oh, you're mourning incorrectly. You should be more kind of dignified in your mourning. But she's all like, she's 100% into it, right?
Right.
So
pure expressive grief,
Yeah, pure expressive grief, exactly. So once Set is kind of gone, we sort of I think after that we jump to Moses. So we kind of jump forward in time. and we get the biblical explanation of his mother, whose name I can't remember, finding him in a basket, and he sort of grows up under a Setian rule. He's a pharaoh, he's royalty, but he wants to learn. He wants the Jes Grew, basically.
Right.
So he's on his travels, and he ends up finding this guy named Jethro, which I thought was really funny.
Yeah.
Who has that thing. He's an Osirian musician, essentially, and him and his old buddies are able to kind of conjure this sort of, this mind magic with their music. So Moses, and this is where the book gets funny at a lot of points, but the book, I think, had me actually laughing when they're describing Moses trying to get ingratiated with Jethro.
That was funny, yeah.
Because he's like, I guess I'm about to leave, and he's like, oh, well, I can't give the secrets to anybody who doesn't, marry my daughters. And then Moses comes back and says, oh, I couldn't leave because I'm just so in love with with your daughter.
With your beautiful.
So Moses essentially steals the secrets, falls out of favor with Jethro, but he doesn't realize that if you follow the Book of Thoth at the wrong point, there's a point that he makes a bit later in the book, and I think at this point as well, which is like there's no good or bad magic. There's just magic that you can do at inappropriate time.
Right.
And when you do it at the wrong, comes the wrong thing. So Moses essentially inadvertently becomes a Bokor because he doesn't heed those warnings.
Right.
And he's able to, like, he even says, like, he'll just perform simple Bokor tricks like turning a staff into a snake. He becomes
kind of scared by the power he realizes that he has.
Yeah.
Moses.
Yeah.
Right.
So then he becomes this sort of like disgruntled, leader of these people. And, and there's a great bit when they're worshiping the golden calf, because Reed goes into how the bull has been emasculated in modern astrology and all these other things. So he sees them worshiping the bull god Apis. He kind of loses his shit and doesn't like it. So he ties it into biblical mythology really nicely there. But then you jump all the way to the Templars, right?
Knights Templar, in the 1100s, right?
Yeah. And
also just pointing out, like, it's really hard to convey the language that this whole 40-page myth
it's all really funny, and it's written,
very funny.
It's written with people like almost like kind of just jive talking at certain points,
No, it does use jive talking at one point. I mean, I just wanted to just to give an example, like when this whole section when he first he mentioned during the whole history of how this all went down. And he talks about the last attempt of Julian, who was like the last, person to try to fight back against Christianity. But the Atonists were too powerful for Julian. He was assassinated. And he says he failed in his gallant attempt to reverse the Atonist challenge. He foresaw the bad news it was going to bring to the world. John Milton, Atonist apologist extraordinaire himself, saw the coming of the minor geek and sorcerer Jesus Christ.
The minor geek and sorcerer, yeah. I'm sorry.
As a way of ending the cult of Osiris and Isis forever. And then he goes on, but just to get back, like sort of tying into what you were saying earlier about how Reed really like rips into the critics. He talks about, he's still going on about John Milton, and he mentions there's a part from Paradise Lost that he quotes. And he says, this is from his hymn, blah, 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 in Paradise Lost on the morning of Christ's nativity, which is nothing but a simple necktie party out to get Osiris's goat. And those Timberland is the music, that Jethro played. And he said the music of Jethro's people were worshippers of those festivals where they had a ball, boogieing, expressing themselves, like you said, talking jive.
Right.
John Milton couldn't stand that. Another Atonist. That's why English professors like him. He's like their amulet, keeping niggers out of their departments and stamping out Jes Grew before it invades their careers.
Yep.
And then he get, so and this is in the middle of the part about the reinterpretation of the myth. So he jumps around in time. He goes out, he criticizes academia, John Milton. Then it's back to Thoth, Set, Osiris, Moses, all, flowing smoothly.
Right. Yeah.
It's something. It's remarkable. Yeah. But
I don't even know how he did it. I don't know
I
how he
know.
did it. He had to
Yeah.
just, it had to be written quickly. It had to be done
It seems
in a
like
quick
it.
go.
Um,
I couldn't see this being something that you would think over for too long. You'd
yeah.
have to just be like, no, I'm just going for it.
You got to have the knowledge inside, and then it comes, and then you do it.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
that's sort of like, so, he basically, I think it also, I guess it makes a point, without stating it outright. There's something, I guess, in human nature or in human beings, in the human mind, maybe, that seems to find it simpler to gravitate towards Atonist thinking. I mean, why else are the Atonists? There's no doubt the Atonists are winning in history and have won more often than not in history.
Right.
Right. And the book doesn't really deny that.
Yeah.
So why is it that Set won over Osiris, and then John Milton and the others passed this along, and Freud? I guess that's implicit in the in the book, is that there's something that's in the human mind, that it finds it more fits more nicely with Atonist kind of thinking than not. And that there always have to be people like Papa Labas, and he's there at the end to say there is a countercurrent to this. There is an alternative. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that one of the main things that would make it more difficult to handle than Atonism is that it's inherently complex. One of the things about Jes Grew throughout the whole book is that as a reader, you're constantly trying to define it in your head. You're trying to figure out what exactly it is.
Yeah.
To a certain point, and then I think I got to a point in the narrative where I sort of got it intuitively, if I wasn't able to get it down in precise language.
I don't think he wants you to get it down. If he
I don't think he does.
He'd give you the text or some of the text, and he doesn't.
Precisely.
Burned, so
yeah, that's right. That's right. And it was burned. And it's important that it was burned also, because part of Atonism is the idea of having a text, is the idea of having this sort of straightforward set of rules that you can follow, whether they're the 10 Commandments or Hammurabi's Code or whatever the rules happen to be. Like, you have to follow the rules. You have to have discipline, and Jes Grew doesn't do that.
Just on that, like Hinkle von Vampton was working. That whole thing with the black android, they were writing a newspaper, right? Weren't they always putting out? So again, it was words, text. This is how we're going to influence people through text, through words.
And it's almost important to think about like what it's even called. It's called Jes Grew, right? It just grows. It just grew.
Yeah.
So in a way that pertains, to my mind at least, more through music that seems to happen almost as you listen to it, more so than in text. I think that this in particular, I would go so far as to say that this is a Jes Grew text, because it does seem to just grow from different points and then end whenever it wants. But that sort of lack of symmetry or adherence to plot or what have you is exactly doing that kind of thing. Atonism is, you have to get from point A to point B. You have to have this sort of character development. You have to have this, and this happen. So in a meta way, the text of Mumbo Jumbo in and of itself is an anti-Atonist screed.
Right.
Screed, what have you. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I know. I think it makes total sense. And I think the title, Mumbo Jumbo, Mumbo Jumbo, at the very least, there's a couple of meanings. To white people, to standard white sort of civilization, Mumbo Jumbo means, nonsense, right? You're talking Mumbo Jumbo, you're talking hoodoo, you're talking spells. It means nonsense. Stop talking Mumbo Jumbo. It also means, it's another sort of, which I didn't know until I read the book, but there's another epigraph here, if I can, comes from Mandingo, West African language. And he gives the African version, which is similar to Mumbo Jumbo. It's Mama Gombo or something. And it means, quote, magician who makes the troubled spirits of ancestors go away. Magician who makes the troubled spirits of ancestors go away. So in the African original version, it has a very meaningful and actually positive definition.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
That's a great meaning.
Yeah, and it kind of feels like if you were to be talking to spirits of ancestors in order to calm them down, you wouldn't give them an ABC plot, because I don't think
Right,
they would understand that very much. They'd understand
right.
feeling more than they would understand the logic of a plot.
Linear, progressive. Right, right.
Exactly. You're
Yes,
outside of considering this cosmology as a real thing. You would be outside of time. You wouldn't have
right,
a body anymore. You would only understand feelings. So they would understand things like music or,
right.
you know, or imagery or what have you. And that's, I think, what this
Right.
book
And no, I
does.
know. And I think that, I mean, even there in the title, you get a perfect example of the sort of dichotomy. You have the Western standard definite Mumbo Jumbo. That's the title of Ishmael Reed's book. You
Hmm.
have the standard Western definition of what that means, which is nonsense. Yeah, nonsense, idiots, whatever, something that
Right.
doesn't make sense. Which then you have the African definition, which is perfectly in tune with Reed's themes, which is to look at things from an Afrocentric viewpoint, pre-Western civilization or alternative to Western, which is the Mandingo definition is a completely different and very meaningful definition to
Right.
the standard Western definition.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
partly the book in a nutshell right there.
Yeah, it's not that it doesn't make sense. It's not that it's nonsense. It's that it's something other than your sense.
Right. And
You know?
and in this case, to sort of what does it say? To sort of wipe away or make the troubled spirits of ancestors go away. We sure as hell need a lot of that, based on what the Atonists have given us. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
That's partly
Yeah.
what the book is also is telling us. We could use a lot of mumbo jumbo. We need a lot of it to help us get rid of all the stuff that the Atonists and our ancestors. But you were talking like about the end of the book, and I think consistent with everything we're saying is, and then the sort of non-linearity is this, at the very end, he's a writer who, like some other writers too, like even Gabriel Garcia Marquez, maybe in 100 Years of Solitude, the idea that time is cyclical, not linear.
Yeah.
Because at the very end, after that whole sort of back and forth with that guy outside the Berkeley, the lecture that he gave, who's like, why don't you say this? And it should be like that. It should be very disciplined. And the last words of the novel are, time is a pendulum, not a river.
Mm-hmm.
More akin to what goes around, comes around.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which seems to be implying that, again, this sort of time is more circular or goes in circles than a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
The Jes Grew will keep coming back. The Atonists will keep trying to stamp it down, but it'll keep coming back. Characters don't develop like they do in a standard novel. How come this character? None of that would fit with this kind of thinking or this kind of book when time is circular, not linear, I think.
So would you say that right now we're in a time of Jes Grew or we're in a time of Atonism?
That's a good question. I mean, in some ways, this has got to be considered a very Atonist time, from what I can tell.
Very Atonist.
It's got to be. It has to be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't see how you could interpret it as, I mean, I think that's a very good question. I think right, we kind of have maybe the genius of the time now, at least from the Atonist perspective, is people think they're living Jes Grew because you have a lot of easily digestible enjoyment at your fingertips.
Uh-huh.
Right? You can come home and spend all week. You can not leave your house one time all weekend and just indulge in enjoyable things. Because everything is at your fingertips. We all know what's at our, right? Everyone knows what that is. Between Apple Music and Amazon, and whatever you like, it's there for you to do easily. And you don't have to be wealthy to partake, right? It's at everyone's fingertips, almost everyone's fingertips. So it seems like you're living Jes Grew, but that's not really Jes Grew. It's just sort of, it's not unenjoyable. I mean, I don't mean it's terrible, but it's not just. Whereas then you go out and you go about your Atonist week, and you go about your Atonist life, the life that's sort of demanded by the Atonist, I should say. It's more that.
Right.
So that's maybe what's different than in 1972. It's not quite so like Atonist versus, or in the 20s. It's not Atonist versus Jes Grew. there's enough diversion that it could seem Jes Grew like, but it's not really Jes Grew. It's very much Atonist. That's
Right.
my
So
interpretation.
so if we were to have a sequel to Mumbo Jumbo, it would have to include things like the internet. And it begs the question, is the internet Atonist or is it Jes Grew?
Is it
And
more Jes Grew?
I think it depends on what you look at. I think now
Yeah.
obviously it's more Atonist. The Atonist will always have the biggest slice of the pie as far as I'm concerned. You know, like you'll see that with things like news outlets and everything kind of collapsing into a linear sort of narrative that it's easy for people to understand. But there are little pockets of Jes Grew out there, and I think you do kind of find them when they're not gross, right? I think you do tend to find them in the conspiracy realm, in the kind of realm of some more fringe artists. I think that what's maybe really valuable about Jes Grew versus Atonism is that it's not a very hard binary. You can get a little bit of the peanut butter and the chocolate and vice versa. You can have something that seems very Jes Grew but is in fact Atonist and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
Like
I think that's
have
more
to be,
so now than before.
Yeah. Well, but what you have to be looking for at the end of the day is this a thing that pushes forward a narrative, a primary narrative that we're all supposed to swallow, or is this something that is almost largely unconcerned with narrative and is more concerned with just kind of visceral experience?
Right.
And I think with art, that's really telling for, I don't know, if we're looking at movies or music from today. It's like because it doesn't, I guess what I'm getting at is that it doesn't even matter if it's good or bad. You and I have talked about this before, how good and bad are such boring indicators of the interestingness of a particular piece of art. And I almost feel like Jes Grew and Atonist, I might nerd out a little bit and start using that as my new binary for how to explain the things that I like or don't like, because it says a lot. It's very complex and you'd have to explain it to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I feel like this really kind of put a finger on things that, you know, sometimes I'll go to see a film that is widely praised and it'll just feel off to me. It doesn't feel alive. It doesn't feel
right.
You know. And then vice versa, I'll see something where people say like, "Oh, this is really bad," and I'll go see it and think, "Oh no, this feels like a person made it. This is good."
That would be instead of like Siskel and Ebert with thumbs up, thumbs down. We do like a movie. Let's say it's movies, books, whatever, and it's like that would be the final verdict. It's definitely more Jes Grew. I don't know, David. I thought that was very Atonist. I really thought that was Atonist.
I tended to find more Atonist sensibilities in this film myself, and I would say that sounds very Atonist of you to say.
But I think one area though where I think it is where you do see a lot of Atonism is it's very confused. It's more complex now. That's true, but like one thing in this book that is really pushed, that's a major part of the book that I think is more prevalent now, clearly, than when Reed was writing in 1972. Things have progressed a lot more where, like, the idea, it's way more widespread now that, the idea of Western civilization, more or less white Western civilization, is not the end all and be all. I mean, that's clear, right? There are more voices. There are more people who look at history from a different perspective in the arts and everything, and they're out and about and very vocal. And that's fantastic, right? That's
it's
something
great.
Where right.
Yeah. It's great, but is that what you say it is, or is that just the rise of the talking androids?
No, but no. Well, there are some talking androids. There always will be. That's true. But I think one area where conceivably you see Atonism tangled up with that is, and it cannot forget, in my opinion, that one of Ishmael, and this comes through in some of his other books too, that he really, really, really rejects is the idea of one way of seeing things. And a lot of people who may now, let's say, ascribe to a counter narrative to the dominance of white Western civilization. They have a counter narrative, but they're still ascribing to oneness, right?
Yep.
These people are right. These people are wrong. This person did something, right. They're out. This person is good. This person is right. Not good. That person's right. A piece of shit. That's totally atonistic thinking, as I perceive it, according to this book. You know what I mean?
I've often brought this up when it comes to things like politics. You know,
the oneness theory.
Yeah,
right.
the oneness. It's the idea that okay, we can all agree that Donald Trump sucks, right? I think we're all on board with that. But I always have this thought experiment in my head of, but what if he started doing really good things? Mm-hmm. Just hypothetically.
Right,
I'm
right.
not saying this is a real thing.
Saying. Yeah.
Like what if one day he just started doing everything that you and I on the left wanted to do? Mm. Would we be able to say, hey, this is pretty fucking good? Like, mm-hmm. And I don't think we would be able to, because I think that we are Atonists on our own side. And I think that we have this binary of what's good and bad. And I think that the reason why that thought experiment is important is because I think that you can find those things if you look hard enough. I think that's going to make a lot of people spill their coffee all over their shirts and become like very irate and say like, this person has never done anything good. And I would say, just calm down. I'm just saying that our eyes aren't open to those things, even if they were to be happening.
Right. No, right. I mean, I think that, and I think, you know, on the sort of like literary side or the signaling side, mm-hmm. I mean, I would love to ask Ishmael Reed, you know, you were talking about Atonism or not, like the whole aspect in this book and in many of his other books of, you know, like more in tune with the James Baldwin, Charles Wright discussion. Mm-hmm. You know, there's so much just in our world, like the literary world, there is so much like phoniness and kowtowing and virtue signaling and all the typical bullshit that goes on every day. And everybody, you know, parading their virtue and parading they believe in the right things, et cetera, et cetera. There is no way any self-respecting satirist would look at that and be like, this is the most ridiculous bullshit I've ever, even if people sometimes are right. It's not so much about right or who's correct.
It's not about right or wrong.
About the
That's
issue.
not what Atonism is.
It's the behavior. It's the human phoniness behind it. You know what I mean?
That's why this is such a valuable metaphor for what we're going through right now. Because what Reed is saying in that essay that you sent to me that's on LitHub, what he's saying is not, he never says that Baldwin's a bad writer. Right. He never says that those books are bad. But he says that there's a fundamental difference going on between how these two people acted within their personal lives and how that affected their art, whether the words on the page are good or bad. Like, you know, Baldwin very specifically started pivoting to white not heterosexual, but white homosexual characters to get his point across better and to ingratiate himself more. And Wright was still writing about the floozies and junkies and all these kind of people. And I felt like when I'm reading all this, I felt a kindred spirit, because it's something that I often try to articulate when I'm thinking about writers that you and I know and the world that we live in, where I'm like, I'm not saying that any of this is bad. I'm just saying that it's very Atonist. I just didn't have the word for it.
Very few people will know what you're talking about.
I just didn't have the word for it.
Give me like a little no signal, you know, to know I know what you mean.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you'll do the little finger wiggle. But I was always looking for this word and I never knew what it was. And it was, you know, in my career in books, I've seen these people who I would label as Atonist. I've seen them kind of rise up and become very successful, and there's nothing wrong with them. Some of my best friends are Atonists. I should get that on a shirt, right? But
good name for a new book. Some of my best friends are Atonists.
Some of my best friends are Atonists. But that's kind of what I'm getting at. And then you kind of see, because people who are Jes Grew, because they're so kind of wild, they're so untamed. I think of certain friends of mine whom I will not name on this podcast. but who are brilliant writers who've had some kind of success, but who, for example, haven't been able to keep their mouths shut when they needed to be shut. People who
when success comes knocking, they're just not
when
there, or they say
success
the wrong
comes
thing to the
knocking, they're
person at the
not
door.
there.
One or the other.
Yeah. When success comes knocking, they don't like the way they look through the peephole and say, keep moving. Whereas some people who are also my, again, best friends are Atonists.
Right.
There are some people I see who just continue. They're always home. They're ready.
Right.
They've cooked a full meal for success to come. Success will come right in.
Come right in. I have an appetizer I have an hors d'oeuvre ready for you right now.
So, and I can't, besides just being sort of contrarian and sort of a general misanthrope, I've had trouble articulating what bothers me about that. And what I love so much about Mumbo Jumbo is that it gave me two words that in typically white guy fashion, I can co-opt for my own uses. So there we go.
I gotta say too, like, just on a level, like just a reading level. I mean, when you think of, we were talking about this a little bit the other day. First of all, I just love. If somebody like was to put a gun to my head and say like, what is your favorite form of writing, of literature? I would say I wouldn't name one type. But I would say that there is no type I like better. And this would be definitely honest and true. There's no type I like better than great satire. It's the rarest, going back to Gulliver's Travels, some of the Mark Twain. Ishmael Reed is in that league. The great satirist. I think it's the hardest thing to do. It's so rare. I'm not talking about humor, but a certain kind of satire. It's really, I think, it takes a certain kind of rare genius to write that level of great satire. Vonnegut does it, sometimes. It's really rare. And
people today don't mostly do it. Comedians do it now, I think.
Comedians do it. No, and that's one reason, like, there's nothing like a great comedian, because they say things and they express things in a way that other people can't or won't do. And it's really rare. And comedians are like among the few who do it now. That's true. How often do you see a rare satirical movie? Huh?
Chappelle's one of them.
Chappelle's one of them.
Yeah.
Right? And satirists have always also faced a lot of, they faced a lot of vitriol and flack, and that's a good satirist, because they're getting under people. A bad satirist means they're just like nasty and they're not funny. But when you have a great satirist and they're making really valid points, they may be ugly points difficult points.
They get so pissed.
Aside from comedians, because there are obviously some great black comedian satirists who've been around in the last 30, 40 years. That's another thing about Ishmael Reed. It's a basic point and an obvious one. How many great black literary satirists have there been in history? There are a few.
Good question, man. Paul Beatty's really good.
Huh?
Paul Beatty's really good.
Yeah, right. There's one named George Schuyler who wrote in the 1920s, who's not as well. He wrote one of the first black sci-fi novels, a sci-fi satire where people can change their skin color between black and white. And lo and behold, they did a reissue some years ago. And who do you think wrote the introduction?
Ishmael Reed.
Ishmael Reed, yeah.
There we go. There we go. No. Man, well, I'm gonna end it on this note. So I have about 5 Ishmael Reed books in my queue. I have Reckless Eyeball.
I have that Reckless Eyeballing. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, Reckless Eyeballing. What else do I have? Hold on. Let me actually look this up so I don't get this wrong. Let me see what my library looks like right now. Oh, it's not on this computer. Fuck me. Well,
Yellow Radio Broke Down.
I have that. I have there's one that has a different country in the name.
Flight to Canada?
Flight to Canada. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. He says he invented, actually, when you read that one, that'd be a good one. Just even if we just talk off the cuff, because that's a book where he actually satirizes, of all things, the slave escape narrative, which who would even think of satirizing something like that?
Yeah. Well, I certainly wouldn't, but he can. He can do no wrong in my eyes right now. Like, I'm just like, whatever he does, it's cool. I got The Last Days of Louisiana Red.
Right, I read that
which seems like another Papa LaBelle book.
Yeah. That's
And
the next
then,
one after this, the one he wrote right after this one,
yeah,
after
yeah.
Mumbo Jumbo.
I want to get his Walking in Oakland memoir. I like those kind of travelogue type
Yeah.
books, and I would love to see what his mind does with. This is how good Ishmael Reed is. Like, when I saw that he wrote a book about walking around Oakland, I thought, yes, I have to read that. I have to, which actually, if you don't mind, I would like to kind of end on this sort of note with, talking about somebody like Ishmael Reed, talking about different auteurs, right? Not just authors, but auteurs.
Yeah.
These people. We had this really interesting conversation about writers recently, and we were talking about how writers that we know attempt to achieve, fame and glory by sort of finding the right plot that they think will sell, and then writing the book that is very palatable, what have you. And I was like, oh, when I was reading this book, I realized they have it all backwards. You have to be an interesting mind first, and then you can write about anything. You can write Flight to Canada about escaped slaves. Well, I can't. He can.
Right. No. I know what you mean.
But people and I think when I was talking to you, I brought up Otessa Moshfegh, who wrote My Year of Rest and Relaxation, which is about a woman who lays in bed the whole novel and takes a bunch of sedatives and is just generally terrible. Which if you were like, do you want to read a novel about that? I would say no.
Does not sound thrilling. Right.
Does not sound thrilling. But when I saw that book come out and I saw the name Otessa Moshfegh, I'm like, I will read that because I want to spend time inside of her head
with her. Right.
Exactly. So what we're missing from modern books is that kind of that genius.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to live inside their head for 200 pages. I don't care what it's about.
I just
want to be there.
Because I know it'll be something I know it'll be something interesting. It'll be idiosyncratic. It'll be, it'll be right. No, I agree. I agree. I mean, when I think, and when you're right. Coming back to this book, that was the kind of thing that set it off for a lot of set that kind of thinking off in relation to a lot of writers where you remember just picking up a book and saying like you just did with the rest and relaxation book. It's not even so much what it's about. It's I want to read that author.
Yep.
Yep. Remember another roadside attraction. It's about a girl with big, girl with big thumbs, and she says whatever. It's Tom Robbins. It's got to be good. It's gonna. What's he talking about? I'll find out. It's gonna be interesting.
I'll find out. Exactly. And that's part of the interesting thing. It's like, what is it about? I don't know. I just want to see what this guy's got to say. I just But we need more of these kind of these sort of polymaths, right? Like these people who are just interesting thinkers.
In and out of themselves, right? Yes.
I mean, I've found them outside of the realm of fiction. I found nonfiction people who I kind of follow online who always seem to have something very kind of counterintuitive and interesting to say about whatever is going on. And whatever they put out, I will consume because that's interesting to me.
Right. No.
But a lot of these people, it's like, I'm writing a book about this, that. And it's like, well, you should maybe try being a genius first. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, also, I think a lot of that related to that is they have here's my plot, blah blah blah. I don't just offhand, thinking of writers read over the years, and you mentioned the Ishmael Reed going through Oakland. When I think of the best just travel writers, Oakland, if in and out of itself, I'm sure it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. It's history. You want to see what Ishmael Reed, his impressions and his thoughts are about that city and its history and everything else. When I would pick up a book by Joan Didion or V.S. Naipaul, I'm just trying to think of people offhand. No matter where they went in the world, books by writers who are great novelists, but also they travel a lot. That was exactly I want to see what Joan Didion thinks of El Salvador. I mean, El Salvador is interesting, but I want to see what she thinks of El Salvador or Miami.
But that's also why you would read Pauline Kael on movies. Who gives a shit about the movie? Let's spend a few minutes in Pauline Kael's mind. because that's what's actually interesting.
Regardless of the movie, it might be a movie I'm not even all that interested in. You know, I'll probably see it if after but I want to see what she said about it.
Exactly. And I think that if we leave on any kind of note, because we're coming up on an hour, well, we passed an hour. Jesus.
It's like a normal phone call.
That's right. Every time that me and Scott get off the phone, I look at it and I'm like, Scott, we've been talking for 2.5 hours. Like,
I always show up to work with bags under my eyes, and they ask me why, and I say, it's Osborne. Last night it was Atonist against Jes Grew. Nobody knows what I'm talking about, but anyway.
Like, that guy's fucking weird. But he's also our boss, so we got to be nice to him.
So we got to be nice, yeah.
But no, but
I'm gonna get Atonist on your ass, and you're not gonna like it. So.
You're not gonna like it. Very disciplinarian. But no, I think that if writers can take anything away from this, it's like this kind of it's seemingly trite, but if you were to put it into the Atonist or Jes Grew category, it's like anything that you're thinking about writing, write that thing. And all of the rules that you've internalized them for a reason, because they will be there to serve you when you kind of need them and you have to pull them out. But don't have fidelity to those rules. Like start writing crazy shit. Just crazy shit. It's a book that doesn't have a third act, or it's a book that, has these characters that you never get into, or it's a book where you have a character that you really get into, and to the expense of everything else, like Mary Robinson or something like that,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's like just feel that kind of like Jes Grew spirit and realize that you have no obligation to follow these rules.
Yeah.
Like just do your thing. I just know if I find an artist where I feel like they're just kind of doing their thing, I'm a fan immediately.
Yeah. Learn everything you can, read on everything. So like you just said, you internalize everything, but once you get into it, then all bets are off. Use the rules as appropriate and forget the rules. Like, exactly. Instead of just following. When people start talking about 3 acts, my eyes glaze over at this point.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's like, but what if the third act sucks? What if it's not like, I'm having a lot of trouble with my third act? It's like, then don't do it. Then don't have one. Like, who cares? Who cares?
Yeah.
There's no rules here. Nobody's making any money.
I know. Exactly.
It's not an assembly line where you have to do XYZ to make sure that you get paid for the day. Like, you can just fucking end it. It's fine. Like, just end your book. Yeah. I would find a lot more books much more interesting if they just ended suddenly.
Yeah.
Where it's just okay, I guess that's it.
Yeah, right. I'm right. I mean, if there's nothing, that's. I mean, I was just reading, not too long ago, this book by this, Swiss writer Fleur Jaeggy. I know you know.
Yes.
You know who she is, and she wrote this book, 3 Imaginary Lives, about 3 people. The only one I really know well is Thomas. 3 people who are not even all that relevant anymore. I mean, why read Thomas de Quincey? They're all from the 1800s. They're all writers. Thomas de Quincey, who wrote, Confessions of an Opium Addict. Keats. Everybody knows John Keats, I guess. But I mean, I haven't read John Keats since high school. Whatever. Yeah. And a French writer I never even read. Marcel Schwab was his name. So, but I like her. So this is a perfect example. De Quincey, I'm interested in, but I've read his books, and like I don't have to read something else, but I like her. So it's like, let me read this book. And she wrote 3 essays. The book is made up, and they're like little biographies. Each biography is no more than 6, 7 pages. They're so dense, 8 pages, summing up. It's just fascinating the way she does it. Her mind with her language, and I don't know. She could say, I'm going to write 3 books about my 3 neighbors. 3 essays about my 3 neighbors in Switzerland. I'd read it.
You'd buy the fucking book.
I'd buy the book.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, on that note, that is the end of our second part of our talk about Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. Seriously, go read this book. It's really good. We should stress also, all of the stuff we've been talking about, he really sincerely meant is a very funny,
enjoyable book. It's 220 pages. It's not a
Flies
hard
by.
book. There's a
Flies
ton
by.
of stuff in it. But it's not a hard book to read at all.
Flies by.
Yeah, really does.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott, for coming on the show. I appreciate you with this whole like week-long gap and everything, like coming back.
I know it was hard to keep track, but I did my best.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay, that was my pleasure. That was fun.